So you're out shooting a landscape, the light is fading, and you grab your shot and it looks a little bit underexposed on the back of the camera. No worries, you think, I'll just open it up in Lightroom and brighten the image with the exposure slider, and when you do it, the photo is soft, it's noisy, and your photo is ruined. Right there, you just fell for the biggest lie that Adobe has ever told, and in this video I'm going to explain what went wrong, and the answer is going to change the way that you think about exposure forever. My name is Will, I'm a multi-award winning landscape photographer and photography coach, and the crazy thing is that most landscape photographers don't really understand what exposure actually means. To get to the bottom of this exposure confusion, we need to go back to the fundamentals of photography just for 1 second. The exposure triangle. So, aperture, shutter speed, ISO, it's one of the very first things that every photographer learns, and it's in every beginner guide, book, YouTube video photography course, and in a lot of ways it's a useful way of teaching exposure. It gets you thinking about these three settings working together, which is a good starting point, but here is the lie that's buried inside the triangle. And that lie is quietly costing landscape photographers like you and I on image quality on every single shoot. And to uncover this lie, let's take a look at the actual definition of exposure. So it's defined as, exposure refers to the amount of light that reaches your camera sensor when taking a photograph. That is it, nothing more. It's light hitting your sensor. It is photons coming through your optical system and hitting the sensor at the back of it. And there are only two settings within the exposure triangle that affect how much physical light, photons, hit your camera sensor. We've got aperture, which is the opening at the front of your lens. This determines how much of the flow of photons in the direction that you're shooting can enter the lens and then hit your camera sensor. And then we have shutter speed, which gives us a variable of how long we allow the sensor to be exposed to all of those photons that are streaming in through the front of the lens. And that is it. They're the only two settings that actually change the exposure of your image, aperture and shutter speed. And you might be sat there thinking, hey, Will, where does ISO fall into all of this? And why does cranking the ISO seem to make the photo brighter if it's not actually controlling the literal exposure of your image? Okay, well imagine you're at a live gig and you're one of those weird people who record a video of the band with your phone and then you're never going to watch the video back. Well, you hold up your phone, you click record, and whatever the microphone picks up in that room, you're recording. Now, when you get home, you crank up the volume, and when you listen back to your recording, of course, it gets louder. But here's the thing, it's not just the band that's got louder, it's everything that was going on within that environment at that moment in time. So the girls that were stood in front of you who were screaming, the overall cheering of the crowd, your mate prodding you in the back, asking you to turn around so he can give you the 2 beers that you just bought that were crazy expensive and absolutely taste like crap. You just amplified, when you increase the volume of that video recording, you've amplified everything that was already there. Both the signal, which is the band, and then the noise, which is everything else, you've amplified them both equally. And that is exactly what ISO does. Your aperture and your shutter speed determine how much light hit the sensor, and that's the recording. Then ISO takes this recording and amplifies it, like turning up the volume. So your photo appears brighter, but if there was noise in the image before you brightened it, all of that noise now becomes visible too. So your ISO setting doesn't create noise, it just shows you the noise that was already there. Which leads us on to the lie that Adobe tells you every time you go to edit an image in Lightroom. The exposure slider? Well, it's not changing the exposure of your image at all. How could it, right? How could it retrospectively add more photons into the system that are hitting your sensor and that data being recorded? It can't. All it's doing is increasing the brightness of your image by amplifying the data in a similar way that your ISO setting does on your camera, but on your computer instead. So if your ISO setting on your camera or Lightroom's incorrectly labeled slider isn't controlling the exposure of your photo, what do you have to do to get the perfect exposure in the moment that you take your photo so that you can get the best results when you come to edit it later on? Well, my friend, that is where the histogram comes in. Now, I know that the histogram on your camera is a graph, and lots of photographers, landscape photographers, like being out in nature, and they want to avoid the technical data side of photography, and they want to shoot with their feelings. But I promise you that it's a really useful tool, and once you wrap your head around it, you can go back to your arty-farty process of taking photos, but now they won't be soft and full of noise. So let's look at the histogram, right? What is the histogram actually showing us? Well, the histogram's actually pretty simple. If you imagine each of the photo sites on your camera sensor as being the pixels that are displayed on a screen or on the back of your camera, then the histogram is showing you a visual representation of how bright or dark those pixels are from left to right, from dark to light. It's actually easier to understand this from a visual representation here of what a histogram looks like. So if all of the pixels are 100% black, then your histogram would have one single peak on the left-hand side of the chart. If they were all white, you'd have a single peak on the left-hand side of the chart. And if we shot a linear gradient from black to white, then the histogram would show the range of brightness across all of those pixels from black to dark grey, mid-grey, all the way to the brighter side of things. So when you're out in the landscape exposing your image, how do we use this histogram? How do we use this tool to make sure that our photo is properly exposed? Well, we do two things. You absolutely do not want your highlights to be hitting the right-hand side of the histogram. And I know this sounds kind of strange, but there's a difference between a pure white pixel on the right-hand side of your histogram and a pure black one on the left-hand side. A pure white pixel is white. If you reduce the brightness of that pixel in Lightroom, all you're going to be doing is reducing the luminosity value of it. So that pixel will go from pure white to kind of grey, darker grey. If you do this far enough, it'll turn to black. A black pixel though, on the left-hand side of the histogram, well, that's a little bit sneaky. Up to a certain point, you can brighten a black pixel using the exposure slider within Lightroom, and it's not going to turn from black to grey necessarily. It's still going to retain some detail. If there's color there, if there's other data there, it's going to retain it. This is because most image sensors can capture a wider dynamic range than what can be displayed on our non-HDR monitors, which is like the monitor on the back of your camera or the monitor that you're probably editing your photos on. And so in these dark shadows, there is data and all of that can be brightened. So what does that mean from a practical perspective as a landscape photographer? It means that we should always expose our images to the right of the histogram. This gives us the brightest overall possible image without blowing out the highlights and permanently removing all the detail in there, whilst also giving us the opportunity to brighten any shadow detail and shadow data in Lightroom once we start editing. This also means that your histogram is, and I really want this to sink in, if you don't pay attention to anything else in this video, please pay attention to this, right? This is the one thing that I bang on about this in my landscape mastery training as well. This means that your histogram is the single source of truth when it comes to exposing an image. What the image looks like down your EVF or on the back of your camera is irrelevant. How you feel about the exposure when you look at it on the back of the camera, or how you feel about your camera settings, irrelevant. Doesn't matter. The best way 100% of the time to expose your landscape images is to expose to the right of the histogram, so you should do it every single time. Okay, so that's the theory done. Now here's the step-by-step framework to implement this when you're out shooting. And if you do these steps in this specific order for every single photo that you take, you're never going to blow out the highlights in your images ever again. So step one is to set the shutter speed for the shot, for the end result that you want to achieve. If you're shooting a waterfall and you want that silky blurred look, then you might need an exposure of a second or 2 seconds or 3 seconds. If you're shooting waves crashing against rocks and you want every single drop of that water, of that energy that's crushing against these rocks, you want it frozen and sharp, then you're going to need to use a much faster shutter speed. So set the shutter speed for the photo that you want to create. Which then leads on to step number 2, which is to set your aperture to control the depth of field. Now, this isn't a blanket rule, but it's most photographers on most locations and most shots most of the time. When we're shooting landscapes, we almost always want the front of the scene and the back of the scene to be in what's called acceptable focus. And we're going to use our aperture to change the depth of field so that we can get everything sharp within the shot. Now, what determines the amount of depth of field that we require for a shot is typically how close our foreground is to our camera. This is because our foreground distance can vary wildly, but the background is almost always going to be near infinity. It's going to be miles away, right? So we want to set our aperture between f5.6 and f16 or so, and we want to look at the depth of field and make sure that we've got everything in focus. And at this point, congratulations, your exposure has been set. The number of photons that are going to enter your camera lens and hit your camera sensor, they've now been determined. They've almost at this point been set in stone. which now means we need to move on to step 3 in the exposure framework, and that is to use your ISO to shift your exposure in the histogram over to the right. So check your histogram. If all of the data is sat in the middle or it's pushed over to the left-hand side, then raise your ISO until the histogram slides over towards the right. But stop before those highlights start to clip off the edge. And that is it really. By using aperture and shutter speed to do the actual work of determining how many photons you're going to capture and then exposing your image, and using ISO only to fine tune how bright your image is using your histogram, you're then going to naturally shoot at the lowest ISO that the conditions that you're shooting in are going to allow. And this is something that I teach every photographer who comes through my coaching program, because it genuinely is one of the things that makes the biggest and most immediate difference to the quality of the files that these photographers come home with. It almost sounds too simple, right? But the improvements in their photos is both measurable via a lack of noise because it's properly exposed, and very real. Now, you might be thinking, Will, what happens if I can't get enough of these photons hitting my camera sensor using my ideal shutter speed and my ideal aperture for the photo I'm trying to create? And when I try to go through this process, my ISO ends up going through the bloody roof. Well, watch this video here where I explain how to use aperture to create noise-free images no matter how dark the subject that you're shooting actually is.